Hello and welcome back to Prism and Company. On the docket today, something that I've kind of wanted to do for a really long time. I have gone through all of my tarot decks and picked out the cards that I best think represent the way that I read that particular card. So, for example, I got these in backwards order here. I will fix that. This is the most representative Ace of Wands for how I read the Ace of Wands. Same with the two, same with the three. I won't spoil all the surprises in there. But this massive Franken deck is kind of representing in some ways my collected tarot wisdom. Not that I'm all that tarot wise, but just everything that I've learned about the deck. I think it's so cool that people have different interpretations and different things that they bring to the deck. And I learned in basically like isolation how to read tarot. And I think that really comes across in how hard this was. I had all of my decks out side by side and I ordered them all the same way. So I would look at all the aces of wands at once and decide which one was the best, all the twos, all the threes, so on and so forth. And a lot of times I was like, man, all these decks are depicting things in a very similar way. And I just don't read tarot in that way, which got me thinking, do I just read tarot wrong? Is there a way to read tarot wrong? I think most people would say no, as long as you like set your intention properly, that whatever you bring to a deck is correct. And as long as go in knowing what you're thinking, that'll be good. It does, for me anyway, create a lot of dissonance with some decks that, I might love the art style or something about the deck or the system or the artist or whatever, but at the end of the day, the images just don't sit right with me because I read in a bit of a different way. That is one reason that I made the Prism Tarot, the deck that I'm working on, is I got to make a deck that just perfectly represents how I read. And can I just say how satisfying of a process that is? Especially after going through this, I just couldn't be more excited to add my voice to this conversation that is tarot. But that is a discussion for another day. This is cool, and I think this is a very representative stack of cards for how I read. And I just couldn't be more excited to share with you guys my thought processes and my approaches. Settle in, because I imagine this is probably going to be a long one. I'm going to talk through every card, how I read it, why the image speaks to me for that particular interpretation, and we'll see how it goes along the way. If you make it through, bravo, first of all, that you want to listen to me talk that long. But I would love to know if there are any cards that jump out at you in a way that's like, whoa, you're totally off from how I read, or, ooh, maybe we read them the same way. I think that conversation is one of the most interesting ones that we can have within the tarot sphere. The idea that we all read different, but can still use this tool in the same way. First of all, that's wild to me that even works. And it totally does. I've seen that happen a ton. But also, I think we can learn so much from each other's approaches. And, it's why this hobby is so cool. It's why it's so special and, near spiritual to people and downright spiritual to some others. So join me as we start. We're going to kick things off with the wands, make our way through all the suits, and then finally end up with the majors. I could not be more excited, guys. I think let's get going. Oh, this is so hard to manipulate because there's so many different size cards. The Suit of Wands. Could you imagine if this was a deck and you had to shuffle this or deal with it? I just couldn't even imagine. I actually kind of love the look of this though. It is just totally wild seeing all these different card sizes and decks. And this actually brings up a point that I've been meaning to rant about a little bit. What the heck, tarot deck creators? Why is every single deck a wildly different size? I both love that for things like La Corte de Tarocchi. The dimensions of this deck are 10 out of 10. Absolutely amazing. But why isn't there a standard size? It's got to be all weird and crazy. But every time I say that, you get the Masonic Tarot, and I love its huge giant cards. So I guess I digress. But for real, a little standardization would be lovely. But I say we start with the ace. I was going to flip over the king. That is not where we're starting. So like I said at the top, I picked these images specifically because they speak to the way that I read tarot. And here in this Ace of Wands, this is from the Masonic Tarot, we have this giant wand in the center that's covered in the chakras. And it's not necessarily the symbols for the chakras, but it's definitely, chakra energy here. We also have some tools at the bottom and kind of this explosion at the top. I read the Ace of Wands and all the aces really as explosive and new and beginnings. So for Wands, it's all about passion. And I love the idea of this perfect alignment of kind of directionality, almost like an arrow that is shooting out, ready to explode. And there's no actual form of it yet. It's not moving. It just has all this momentum kind of built up kinetically. Maybe momentum's not the right word, but potential energy and just like sizzling and popping and ready to go. I was going to think about like how I might utilize that in a reading, but I don't read all that much. So I just want to talk about how the card is. I'll probably change my mind a million times on that. But c'est la vie. Yes, I think this Ace of Wands is totally beautiful. It's a lovely way to start out the suit, and it's just going to kind of get wild from here because the wands sort of go all over the place and then eventually fizzle out. It's kind of a beautiful thing. With that, I say we go on to number 2. For the Two of Wands, I chose the Thoth. You're going to see a theme. There's a lot of Thoth cards in this, but I did challenge myself to pick a different deck for each number. So I didn't want 2 Thoth cards in a row, for example. I break that every now and then just when necessary, but I really tried to break and stretch out of my mold a little bit. Fun fact, I don't like a lot of Two of Wands as it turns out, at least not the depictions that I see in the decks that I own. I read twos a lot, partially as kind of duality, a mixing and matching, but also as just an intensity. We have that potential energy stored up in the ones. The twos is all about just like raw outpouring before there's any chance for refinement. So for wands, that outpouring is like a train barreling down the tracks. This card is called Dominion in the Thoth, and I love the idea of just like, I get this image of wands just burning down a field and just leaving this crevice behind, which can be exciting and, forward moving, but also really destructive. It's kind of this blind, unseen force that is just going and going and going. From the duality aspect, I think I lean into the positive and negative of that. The positive being momentum and burning and going. The negative obviously being the lack of care, the lack of thoughtfulness. It's all of these twos that feel very intense to me. And some of the depictions of the twos are really interesting to me. Like this one does get a little bit of that intensity, but there's also a real softness to the background. It looks a little bit like maybe popping lights or something, but also maybe like flower petals kind of coming out. Just a very interesting soft depiction. And in many decks, there was wonderfully soft depictions. And this leads me to kind of an interesting thought. I learned tarot in kind of isolation. I didn't have other people to really talk things through with. I didn't have a ton of interaction with like the YouTube community at that point when I was first figuring out all of my associations. So I kind of took Thoth and Golden Dawn thoughts, layered my own stuff on top of them, and called that a day. And as I look through more and more decks, I feel like maybe I got it wrong a little bit. And I know like tarot is different to each person, but if like every deck has a very different view and interpretation than what you're thinking, is it really like the right interpretation? And that's something I'm hopefully like trying to work through with this video too. Just like, how do other people see these cards? Is it all that different what I'm saying from what other people think? And I think that conversation is just fascinating. But enough about the two. I say we barrel on forward towards the 3. The 3s are actually some of my favorites in the tarot. I always read the 3s as soft and gentle and kind of slow but growing. Now that I say that, not so much the discs. I'm going to be curious to get to the discs and talk about that too. The Three of Wands, for example, I think of this as young, budding fire in some ways. We have all this intensity from the two that burns through a field and kind of leaves this crevice behind. The three is the fire on the edges of the crater, just gently wisping away at the grass on the outside of it. It's more productive fire. It's burning, it's more healthy, it's not nearly as destructive, it's kind of caring in some ways. And it's the first time we see fire not as this big blasting destructive force, but as something you might consider like a campfire, just something gentle and warming, something you could cook by. I picked this depiction specifically of that kind of because of these flames along the side here. There is something kind of welcoming about this space, and it almost feels like the air is on fire, but it doesn't feel dangerous. It almost feels like you could walk through that and kind of have an experience of like walking through liquid fire in some ways. This is another one where depictions weren't off about the Three of Wands, but they were just kind of different than I'd expect. And this is something after making a tarot deck I've noticed is I got to just put all of my thoughts onto cards. And now I kind of expect other decks to meet those. And they never do, of course, because this is, the Handel tarot. This is Handel's interpretation of the Three of Wands. And I would never want to take that from another deck creator. The idea of being able to pour yourself into a project like this and to put your own thoughts and feelings on is just so cool and special. But all that being said, I do really love the kind of soft, growing nature to this three. I also do relate the minors to their respective majors in some ways too. So if you think of the three in relation to the Empress, the third major in the major arcana, we again have that very kind of budding, growing, creation-y feeling. So the idea of a soft fire to cook by really kind of feeds into that. This is also my birth card, so I'm a little bit biased towards it, but I just love it. Thank you, Three of Wands. This was a delight to talk about. On to four. Now the four fit perfectly. Where the three and the two I had a little bit more trouble finding something that represented it, this four could not be more perfect. I read the Four of Wands as cold fire. That same fire that we saw in the three, that kind of warm, blossoming fire, now very controlled and contained. I almost think of these as like individual contained wands that are self-fueling, almost like a combustion engine where everything's happening internally. I also kind of think of the Four of Wands a little bit like ashes of a fire, the idea that there's all this heat there, but it's contained within and it's not like actively burning. Fire, by its nature, is very unstable and volatile. It literally can't even contain its own physical form, so it has to constantly move and change. It always needs fuel. It always needs oxygen. So this sort of contained fire is either within a closed system or like ashes, literally burnt out, but still containing all of this heat. And I'll say it again, I just love that really closed off feel to this Four of Wands. And just like kind of an interesting visual depiction, I love that this wand is a little bit chunkier than the others. That level of like attention to detail in this deck, specifically the Masonic Tarot, is just tops. It's so cool that, he took the time to craft each one of these wands a little bit individual. And I also love that there's 4 little nubs on each of these wands. It's just a nice callback to the number 4 on the card. Again, those little beautiful details. I think this card really leads nicely into the 5 because we're coming from warm, glowing fire. We're going into cold fire here, and then things get really disruptive as they tend to do in the 5s. So the fact that we have a deadening fire or a more controlled fire just leads itself directly into that more chaotic feel that a 5 brings. Just lovely, just lovely. Can we take a moment and think about how lovely this is? I'm sure doing that. It's actually been approximately 2 minutes and 21 seconds of me doing that. I think it's time for the next though. This deck totally cracks me up. This is the Dame Darcy Mermaid Tarot, and every time I pull this deck out, I cannot believe one, that I own it, or two, that I like it. There's something just that is so appealing about this deck to me, though. It just makes me smile. Five of Wands, very typically depicted as conflict or fighting, but the thing that I like so much about this particular depiction are these two gals right here. They look actively tired, and I like the idea of this not just being conflict, but like tired conflict. After the fire has burned and become warm and kind of stabilized, it's just like done. Fire needs all of this fuel. Fuel's the word I was looking for, to sustain itself and go. And this is fire not wanting to work for it. It is that internal conflict of I need something, but I'm not going to do it. So I feel bad because I can't burn anymore, but I'm not going to go out searching for it, or I can't go out searching. And it's all of this internal fighting and conflict that happens, and it's just tired. I think of the Five of Wands as smoke. If you think about putting out a fire, like you finally pour water on the campfire, the first thing that happens is that it goes up in smoke, and there's a lot of it. Smoke to me feels like tired fire. And I think that's pretty cool here. She didn't have to draw these mermaids as, like wounded from battle almost, like almost getting the black eye vibe down here. Like it might be makeup, but I always read that as a little bit of black eye. I always read that. Like I read tarot very much, and I've also had this deck for like, I don't know, a month tops. Beautiful though. From here, we're going to cruise on into the sixes, and I was going to start talking about the sixes. Let's just take a look at the image first. The sixes. Okay, now we can talk about it. Sixes I always see as rising, and boy, does the Wild Unknown Tarot do a great job with rising images. Literally, we have a butterfly rising out of a bunch of sticks, and I think that's really cool. This image is also unique to this deck in some ways because there is so much white negative space. This deck is very known for and very dense with these kind of small hatch marks, very busy images. So this white space to kind of just breathe is absolutely lovely. Now the sixes, I read like they're rising, but there is still the negativity of the five present in them. We haven't gotten to success yet. It's just kind of emerging out of that space. And what does that look like for fire? To me, that reads as you're out of energy, but you suddenly get a burst of adrenaline, almost like a runner's high. You're running for miles and miles, and you kind of feel like you're hitting your peak or your limit, and then all of a sudden the gears kick in, and you get this rush of kind of endorphins. Fire to me, and many folks, is all about kind of that passion and drive. So the idea of that passion suddenly flooding in feels right to me. And the idea of this butterfly, I was going to say blossoming. Butterflies don't really blossom. Taking flight, showing its wings off. It's getting that burst of color, that burst of rising vertical energy out of this very chaotic five. To me, this is absolutely referencing the previous card. Especially if you look at the deck itself, the Five of Wands has all these disruptive lines moving everywhere, and then we get all that chaos, but then all these vertical lines rising out of it into just this pure white space. Now, the thing with these sixes, with this rising energy, is that it's hard to kind of keep that sustained. And then that careens us into the sevens. We're in kind of a weird little back and forth here for a while as things get pretty good, pretty stable, and then kind of bad. Pretty good, and then kind of bad. Sixes, though, I said threes were kind of my favorite. Sixes are absolutely my favorite in the deck because they feel so human. This idea of rising and feeling good, but still remembering the bad and having definite potential to go off the rails and just have things not work out. I love that internal tension. It really kind of speaks to the human experience, and I think that tarot is all about speaking to that human experience. Very cool and beautiful depiction, Kim Krantz. Just lovely. Let's go on to the seven. For the seven, we got the classic Waite-Smith deck. Oh, it's just lovely. Now, this is the Albano Waite deck, so we have the crazy orange in the background, but it's perfect. It's fiery. It's poppy. Now, the seven, Sevens I always read as very disruptive in a way, not disruptive in the same way as five. Five is kind of internal disruption, like the suit kind of fighting with itself. Seven I read more as maybe opposition, not destruction. So here we see one person kind of fighting and defending themselves against this encroaching army. So it is trying to kind of keep your passion, keep that rising nature from the six, and defend it against this like world that is trying to drag you back down. I think we've all had that experience where we're not feeling good, then you get to be, rising, you're finally getting out of it. And when you're in the six, when you're feeling it, it's very easy to be, that butterfly rising up and just not mention any of this down below. But this is still here. And, this is all around you in a sphere almost. So you constantly have to keep fighting and working for that energy to kind of keep you moving forward. And I think there's something very brave about the sevens, standing up and kind of being a lone wolf. And this idea of just putting in lots and lots of effort. We'll see that show up many times as we go through all the sevens. This idea of just like really hard work, nose to the grindstone. In this particular case, fighting for your passion, fighting to keep energized, and other suits that'll kind of manifest in different ways. When I was learning tarot, that was one thing that I did is, I looked at all the sevens and I thought, how are these sevens the same? If they're the seven of a suit, there has to be some through line. That just makes sense to me. And it was really cool to see how even very different ideas, kind of came about in very similar ways. Like bending your brain to make little sayings that reflect across all the sevens or all the eights or all the fours. Super duper cool. But yes, I love this idea of fighting, and I think this is the perfect depiction to kick off the sevens to really set the stage for what's to come. Let's take a look at the eights, which get a little bit wild. So for the 8 here, I have the Thoth deck. I think I've been saying the names of the decks. If not, my apologies. I am excited and I might forget. Eights for me are all about kind of like wild expansion and kind of like a little bit too much attention or energy. It's not necessarily unsustainable, but it's very volatile. We're coming off of the 6, which is this kind of slow rising, into the 7, which feels very like defensive and full of effort. And then, you imagine like pushing against a wall with all this effort and then the wall breaks. That breaking is the 8. You might fall over and smack your face, or you might take that energy and run and use that momentum. So for the 8 of Wands here, all the wands are just exploding out of the center. And there's prisms of color and light and they're forming rainbows. It's just a lot. But, an explosion like this, especially one created out of light, is hardly sustainable. You could maybe imagine these being like light waves, and those light waves could continue on. Or this could be like an actual explosion, just boom, one and done. All of a sudden it's over. But I do like that idea of that breaking through the wall. To me, that's always a real image that comes to mind. And this is a good as point as any, obviously, hopefully it's been pretty obvious here. Every card is in relationship to each other for me in tarot. The 8 of Wands doesn't necessarily mean one specific thing. It's coming from somewhere and going to something. So that really factors into how I read the card, because it's not an individual idea. It is a moment in time in kind of the narrative that this suit is trying to tell. And how can we take that bit of narrative and focus it through the lens of, in this case, fire, in that kind of passion-y area. So to speak a little bit to that passion for our fire, this is about like too many creative ideas or, being flooded with inspiration that's taking you in lots of different ways, and then trying to hopefully channel that. There are many depictions of the 8 of Wands that are converging, and that's cool. That's the idea of channeling that energy. It's a very positive spin on how that works. But for me, a very successful 8 of Wands is either expanding in some way or like disruptive and moving in lots of different ways. You'll certainly see that in the Prism Tarot. My Eight of Wands is all over the place just because of how I read it. I like the eights a lot, though. I think that eights kind of get a little bit of a bad rap in a tarot deck. I guess specifically like the swords. The swords gets a bad rap everywhere. But this idea of kind of shocking movement and instability can be kind of fun. You have this really wild, like excitement in this card. And then the 9 here, actually, let's go to the 9. Enter the 9. So the 9s are all about taking that really disparate energy and focusing it like an arrow. So here we have the Fountain Tarot, and we can see this guy who is actively building a ladder or a bridge that he's climbing up. So actively so that he's literally placing the pieces as he's moving. We can see his goal clearly, but it's not even there yet. And I think that's so cool. For me, 9s are all about kind of an overwhelming feeling. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. For passion, it's this overwhelming passion pushing you through something that could be, harsh or disruptive. We're taking all of that disparate energy of the 8 and trying to focus it in. But ever since, we've gotten out of the 6, constantly the suit of wands wants to flicker out. That flame wants to dissolve. It wants to kind of fall back into the 4-5 where it doesn't have to work very hard anymore. It wants to consume all its fuel and just be done. But the 9 says, no, we're going to push through. We're going to superheat that fire. And I actually like in this depiction too that it's focusing up to a point. Here we have like the symbol of fire in some ways, and it's getting hotter and hotter as it goes. It's that final push, that final go forward, and that heat is finally going to get to a point where it can just no longer sustain itself. Beautiful depiction. A lot of the Fountain Tarot, I find, has images that just don't jive at all with the way that I read cards, but this one really sings. Now, I will say it's gorgeous and beautiful, and I absolutely friggin' love it, but just clearly the creators of this deck have a very different view of what tarot is. And again, I think that's so cool. But let's settle into the 10. Here we come to the 10. We had all that heat from the 9, and all of our fuel got used up. Finally burnt, finally consumed, but consumed in the proper way. Consumed in such a way that our fuel has turned into white ash. It has completely been used start to finish. And I think this image from the Wild Unknown Tarot speaks beautifully to that. The 10 of Wands is often read as really heavy, like a burden on something, but I always read 10s as completing what the suit is trying to do. And what fire is trying to do is burn. And we get to the 10, we've burned through everything. Everything is totally destroyed. The 2 that initially just like plowed over our field has finally just consumed the whole world. And that might sound heavy and harsh, but that could be good or bad. If you're trying to consume something that was bad, the 10 means that you've gotten there. If you are trying to start something new, the 10 might have consumed the old, or maybe this is the completion of a project that you've been working on. If you're a creative type like myself, you work on a project and you have all these ups and downs and you love it and you're inspired and you can't stand it and you put it away for 6 months and you come back to it. And then just like that 9, there's that final push towards the end and you're burning white hot, and then you get there and just never want to look at it again, at least if you're me. I really hope I don't feel that way about the Prism Tarot, but I probably will for a while. There's more cycles after fire, so things will kind of come around cyclically and get back to the 1, but this fire is definitely kind of burnt up. Now, I like this depiction in particular because we have almost brambles blocking our path. These flames are all consumed. There's ash everywhere. There's smoke, but there's light peeking through. And I think that light refers back to the ace. It's that idea that when something is finished and consumed, almost phoenix-like, the ace will eventually rise back out of it. Because life isn't just start to finish, it's cycles. It's constantly going over and over again. So the idea that a 10 would be the end seems silly to me. The 10 is all about restarting something new. And it's these ashes that will make, fertile ground for new things to grow. It's almost got like a death card feel to it, but instead of focusing on the death aspect in that kind of fertilization, this is all just about like, you're out of fuel, you burned it all up. That is the focus of this card. With so many different cards in the deck, 78, there's bound to be some overlaps like that, at least for me. There's just only so many concepts that humans can hold in their brain. So, this is similar maybe in a little bit to the death card to me, but definitely its own flavor. Now we shall mosey on to the courts. So, Colin, you ask, and I hear you asking, what do we do now that we reach the 10? What the heck? We burned through all of our fuel. Now, okay, now that I've set that up, I actually don't read the court cards as a continuation of the story, but this is kind of a continuation here. This is our Page of Wands from the absolutely lovely La Corte dei Tarocchi. I actually read court cards as elemental overlaps. So wands are fire and pages are the earthy part of that suit. So what is the earthy grounded part of fire? In this case, it is our fuel. So here we can see a lovely budding tree in the background, our page collecting more fuel perhaps. So in this case, we just came off the burning and consuming and, completion of everything. Now we've got more fuel to work with. But like I said, I read court cards kind of out of context of the actual suit themselves. So this one is, to me, fairly straightforward. It is the source material. It is gathering inspiration. It's getting yourself more fuel to burn, because fire is not an unlimited source. It is, in fact, very finite, and you constantly need to be feeding it to keep it sustained. I feel like I probably won't have a ton to say about the court cards, just because, quite frankly, they confuse me. I read them now as elemental overlaps. I've heard lots of really cool ways to view court cards, like a progression of learning or different types of people. Honestly, none of them stick with me. Court cards really foundationally bother me in the structure of a tarot deck. They just feel forced in. But the idea of them being elemental overlaps speaks the most to me. I think I like that. So yes, the page is going to be our fuel. The Knight of Fire is up next. The Brother of Fire here in the absolutely beautiful Tarot of the Spirit. You will see the Tarot of the Spirit show up a lot in the court cards. I actually bought this deck specifically because of the court cards, because they're drop dead gorgeous. The rest of the deck is really beautiful too, except for the majors. I'm like, on the majors. But that is completely not important right now. The Knight of Wands, or the Brother of Fire in this case, is the airy part of fire. So, what is the airy part of fire? It is the expansion of fire. It is the volatility of fire. If any of you read Thoth, you'll notice that my interpretations of the court cards are very Thothy. So that's exactly where I'm pulling from. I'm certainly not trying to make it seem like I came up with all this myself. So kind of that explosive quality, that dangerous quality of fire. And I love that we have this image of a horse here that is just like charging so fast that it's like almost melting into itself. It looks like a bullet in some ways. It has no footing. It almost looks like its hooves are going into water in some ways. It feels dangerous and fast. The person on it is melting away into heat, and it's moving and going. And I think it's kind of cool that we have something so gentle as fuel in our previous card. Oh my goodness. I just want to touch this deck. It's so satisfying. I've never had cardstock this good. It's so lovely. Gentle as fuel, kind of like the thing that breathes life into fire. And then directly after it, the part of fire that makes it really like dangerous and kind of exciting. Because, as much as like volatility can be dangerous and unnerving, it's also the part of fire that makes like fireworks or, a beautiful blaze, a thing of art and beauty. There's a reason that people like to just stare at fires. It's because they're a little bit unpredictable, a little bit wild. And that element is pretty cool here. So, Brother is like a little bit all over the place, kind of like fire is that, that movement, that excitement, but definitely dangerous. So, tread with caution. The Queen of Wands. I bring in the Dame Darcy Mermaid Tarot upside down because this queen needs a grand reveal because, oh, look at that. The Queen of Wands is the watery part of fire. So water's fluidity, water's color and kind of motion. And part of that really feels really showy to me. Fire kind of showing off peacock style. Like, yes, I'm beautiful. I'm not dangerous, I'm elegant. Watch me flow and flicker. And there also feels like a very creative part of the Queen of Wands too. Water is often very inspiring. It churns us, not only like physically from the water, but it's fluid and it's moving and it ever ebbs and flows. And that feels a lot like the creative process too. So kind of the showiness of fire and also the creative, colory, fluidity of fire. That's a difficult word to say, fluidity. The Queen of Wands is another one of my birth cards, along with I'm sorry, did I say the Queen? Doesn't matter. The Queen of Wands, along with the Three of Wands. That's sort of my birth card pairing. And I think it's so funny that the three is this very like gentle warmingness, and then the queen is like, boom, showy, like, let me put on this sweet stocking. I wish so badly that I could have like just reached in with like a gold sequiny glove. And that right there speaks to the little bit of Queen of Wands within me. I love in the image how over the top all of these folds are, and she's on this like crazy lion face chair with lion paws on the bottom. It just feels over the top, but there's also a wand growing here that's kind of quiet and beautiful in some ways. So there is a gentleness to the Queen of Wands. She might be showy, but she's not actually asserting that power over anything. It's just a little bit of like flash and then kind of covering up that liquid fire, that color and passion. All right. I feel like I'm rambling about the Queen of Wands now, partially because I just want to keep looking at how cute that little boat is. But I think it's time to move on to the King. The King of Wands, called the Knight of Wands in the Thoth deck, which always throws me off. But the King is the fiery part of fire. So as fiery as you can get. And I always think of this card like a comet coming in hot. It is going to charge into battle. It's going to get there. And if it crashes and dies, fine. If it hits its target, fine. But regardless, it and everything around it is going down in flames. It is fire that is consuming and moving forward. This kind of feels like the Two of Wands in some way to me. But instead of just the forcefulness, it is the intention of fire. It's the idea that it's going to charge in and not care about what's happening. The Two feels very mindless to me in some ways because it's that one just like finally bursting out and bursting through, where the King knows what he's doing. It's fire being wielded in a way that fire works. Maybe even like a flamethrower. You'd like direct a flamethrower, but once the flame leaves the nozzle, forget it. Fire is going to do what it does. It's going to go hither and yon. And I think that's depicted here perfectly. My favorite part of this image is his cape, which is just turning into liquid fire as it goes down. And we see this horse charging out of it. He's even got a wand, like a lance, almost moving forward. And you can see from his beard here and his hair, and also the horse's hair, that it's not just him moving forward, but there's been like an explosion behind him. And that is pushing the hair in this direction, pushing this whole composition upwards, because once fire has been released, bam, it's moving. It's not going to stop in that direction. It's going to flood everything with itself. It wants to consume and take over. I like the King of Wands. This has always been a very clear reader for me whenever I pull it in readings, just because that idea of like charging in whole hog and, you know, saying screw the consequences, like again, feels very human in some ways. That's something that a lot of folks like to do and just like feels very relatable. You'll also notice as we go through, basically all of my kings are from the Thoth deck. I love the way that this deck depicts the kings. They are powerful, they are full of movement and fire, and many kings are seated or look like older or like more wizened. And for me, the King of Wands at least is like not wizened. He is not going to be old enough to like gain any knowledge because he's charging in and he'll probably die doing it, but have a really great time. And I was going to make a joke that like he burns up and smells good because it's like cooked meat, but I'm pretty sure bodies smell horrible when they're burned. I've officially gone far too deep. I think it's time to move on to a new suit. Well, next time. See ya.